Hello and welcome back to my channel, Checks Captures Threats, and today's episode, in episode 13, we're going over how to use the king effectively. So from last episode we saw how to use the queen effectively. Hopefully you understand how that works with, attacking and not defending, vice versa, all of that. Now, using the king effectively, we have 4 more examples on what you can do. The first one will be castling. Went over a little bit of that previously, but we'll go over both ways to castle. Then we're going over how to use the king as a piece in the endgame when there's a load of pawns. Then on the third example, we'll be going over how to use protection with the king. We've gone over that a little bit as well, but this will be a bit more in depth. And last but not least, we'll briefly go over how to win stuff with like a king and a pawn here. So, hopefully you understand. And in this first example, we're going over how to castle, really. So how castling works. So obviously we know that castling kingside, it's quite simple. We've gone this over a few times with how the pawn structure stays like that, and you don't have to move anything. Sometimes if there is such a great attack on here, so the queen or the bishops are now on this, you may have to go to this square here. It's not always, it's optional over there, but this king has some nice leeway as well, where it can go with the rooks as well, doing what they can on the back rank. Also, we have, that's one side castling. Now, I haven't shown too much what queen side castling is. So, this is where it goes, the king goes 2 squares again, same like this, but the rook goes 3 squares instead of just the natural 2. So what this does is, now you see it's a little bit different, where the pawns kind of feel off-centered. So something you might have to always do, let's say they got their queen was able to get out here and attack on this pawn. Sometimes what you might have to do is bring that king to here, so act as if it's being castle kingside with the 3 pawns like this again, just the rook obviously staying put. You can obviously move the rook back as well if you like the protection in there. We'll go over that in the third example with how that works. So hopefully you understand, you don't always have to castle queenside and then move that immediately. You can push sometimes, bring the knight back, bring the bishop back. There's other ideas you can use to try and protect that pawn, because maybe you want the king here, because later on you can use that to kind of push in at the end game, which I'm now going to show you in the second example. So, in this example, we have a load of pawns, same amount of pawns for each side, but what I'm going to show here is why you should use the king. So for white, I'm going to make them use the king with the pawns, and for black, I'm going to keep the king as it is. So just going to make a few moves. So if I get the king in the centre of an endgame, it can go everywhere. So if black's just trying to, use their pawns, slowly what we can see is how our piece kind of becomes that like extra, a more advanced pawn. Because as you can see, slowly black runs out of moves, so he will have to start moving his king. But if he's not using it as an attacking piece, here we can push, for example. We can cause, now look, we have such a great attack that if it just starts moving its king along, slowly it now has to take. We can just, if it goes here for example, we win this pawn. So if it's using it as a defending piece, if you're using it as a defending piece, it's just not going to work. We can chase these pawns here, whereas, see, if it's just doing this, use the king as an attacking piece, because what we can see is it's just a better pawn, as it can move 1 square anywhere, and just use it to attack. Because some of the pawns here, as we can see, if I go back to the beginning here, there is many, after a few moves, you see there's a backward pawn here. In a second, after this, this is stuck. We can't move really any other pawns, but now because this king's here, we can. Because this king's here, they've got a backward pawn here, they've got an isolated pawn here, they've got an isolated pawn there that, in the end we can capture. So what that's trying to get across is, when you're in an endgame, just try and make sure, at least is if you're using the king in some sort of scenario, whether it's defending a pawn, whatever, but hopefully just make sure you use your king. Now, in this example, we've done this a few times, protecting the king. So obviously we know about when you castle that you've got this 3 pawns in front. Now hopefully most of the time, if you're playing an e4 opening, which we might be going over soon, you might be playing this knight move. You might still be playing it in the Queen's Gambit as well, that we've gone over. Anyway, after this is kind of the setup that the best defends everywhere. Because if I show you here, all of these, we're defending everywhere here. Now we're adding, everywhere here is being defended. We've got that 9 squares of just defence, which, you know, it adds, because when you have, say, again, like a queen here, you know, it could try and attack, but, you know, it's already protected with the king. They have to get at least another piece in, and then by then we could bring our, you know, we don't really want to bring our queen over as we went over last episode, but maybe like bring this knight in, because there's some stuff we can do, like bringing the knight here, you know, and then after a move we can do this. So you see we have this another added protection. So hopefully what you get there is that we need to protect the king. The king, it needs to be open towards the end game, but in the opening and middle game it needs to be as closed and as compact. Not so compact that, you know, we've got 6 pieces blocking it, so that there's like the knight here and then there's like 6 pieces over here. That won't work. You know, you've got kind of spread it out so that you've got a few pieces on the queen side, a few pieces attacking the king side, and then 1 or 2 pieces defending the king. So, and now the last example for today will be just how to use a king with a pawn. So we'll be briefly going over this because soon we'll be doing checkmating with stuff like this, and this is part of it because it will help. So here, what is now called, what we do is we're going to get the opposition. So we're opposite it. Obviously no one can move here, so they're kind of staring at each other. And then when it moves, we're going to move it diagonally. What this does is it covers all 3 squares here, so that the pawn can just merrily go on its way. That's not going to show too much more, because what we're going to do soon is how to do a pawn and a king when the pawn is all the way down here, because it is possible. So using that idea with opposition. So that should be all for today's episode. That will be all of the using the piece effectively. So we're going to have a quiz tomorrow, and that's going to be like a, I don't know how many questions yet, but it's not going to be as much as 20, I don't think. But after that, we're going to have a few episodes of just like how to attack, how to defend, and then we'll start doing the opening stuff. So hopefully you enjoyed today's video. That will be all for today, so thank you and bye bye.